Laughter is one of the greatest therapies in combating adversity, and whole communities and nations have frequently relied on humor to get them through their bleakest times. On August 13, 1961, the barbed wire was rolled out of Berlin to create the Berlin Wall. For nearly 30 years, until it was dismantled, wall jokes proliferated, especially among those living in the East. Laughing was all that was left. It was a way of humanizing the tragedy of an ideology that had divided families and the nation. Wags would ask, "When does a good border guard fire the warning shot?" and answer with chilling wit, "At the end of the second clip of ammunition," thereby making light of the German Democratic Republicans' command to its border guards to shoot to kill anyone trying to cross the wall. Jokes about those who rule you, and sometimes those who tyrannize you, are a form of folklore that has existed in societies as seemingly different as communist in Eastern Europe, Tsarist Russia, modern Egypt, 12th century Persia, and modern-day Iran. Humor can also be wonderfully subversive. It can protect self-respect and identity.
There can be no reasonable science-based doubts about the reality of global climate change, effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of so-called greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by what amounts to mass panic about what to do about it. To many, Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at that time, and later from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can a world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? Is it not in everyone's interests to apply the precautionary principle in attempting to avoid the worst of their predictions, now rather than at some future time? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rahendra Pukuri, has pointed out, 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12 years, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale.
To understand the fight or flight response, it helps to think about the role of emotions in our lives. Many of us would prefer to focus on our logical, thinking nature and ignore our sometimes troublesome emotions, but emotions have a purpose. Our most basic emotions, like fear, anger, or disgust, are vital messengers. They evolved as signals to help us meet our basic needs for self-preservation and safety. It would be dangerous to be indecisive about a threat to our survival, so the brain runs information from our senses through the most primitive, reactive parts of our brain first. These areas of the brain control instinctive responses, and they don't do too much thinking. This most primitive part of our brain communicates with the rest of our brain and our body to create signals we can't ignore easily, powerful emotions and symptoms.
Today, a university like the LSE certainly has to acknowledge that it is in competition for the best students, all of whom have choices they can exercise, and many of them choices which run across national and continental borders. We are in competition, too, for staff. The academic job market is one of the most global there is, and in the 21st century, English is the new Latin, so universities in English-speaking countries are exposed to more intensive competition than those elsewhere. We are in competition for government funding through the assessment of research quality. We are in competition for research contracts from public and private sector sources, and indeed we are in competition for the philanthropic pound. Many of our own donors were at more than one university, and indeed think of the LSE's requests alongside those of other charities to which they are committed. That is the competitive environment which is particularly visible to a vice-chancellor.
Within most developed countries, notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that we have democracies, have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects on people, particularly in working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, hikes were reduced. We can look at medical records and see that actually living standards in among large fractions of the population actually went down. But eventually we passed legislation about working conditions, and eventually we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. We eventually, in the 20th century, we put regulations that imposed better environmental conditions. And so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work in ways that the benefits of it are at least far more widely shared than they were 100 years ago.
In my view, it's impossible not to talk about wildlife and not think about its role in livelihoods. And I guess part of that is my own view, part of the research that I do in Africa. In most East and West Africa, I look at a role all the humans rely on wildlife as the source of food and also the source of income. And we talk about our wildlife. It seems we talk about fish, we are talking about what is probably the single most important source of protein for humans across the globe. And so billions, or more than a billion people, rely on fish as their primary source of animal protein. And most of these people live in poverty. So the management of wild fish resources, that sense, is incredibly important to livelihoods and health. And also, wildlife tourism is the multiple billion-dollar industry, and in many places, such as Africa, South America, it can be the number one source of income. It can be the number one source of foreign income for economies.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices, and they could build a city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way that was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise, and they everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns, they would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. So when we begin to see the Romans building their ideal Roman city, they turn to that so-called castrum, or military camp design.
And then in the 1950s, philosophers had this novel idea that perhaps the mind is just identical with the brain, okay? And this hadn't occurred to philosophers before. And it so happened that it happened around the same time the first departments of neuroscience started forming, like at MIT and Stanford and so forth. But basically, there were a couple of philosophers, both educated here at Oxford, Place and Smart, and they made the claim that the mind just is the brain. So that is the identity theory. And with identity in logic is the strongest relation. When you have identity between A and B, you don't have two things, you have one thing, all right? So now whenever you talk about mental events, you're talking about brain events. Whenever you're talking about brain events, you're talking about mental events, okay? So that's the identity theory. And it's very popular. It's basically the idea that mental properties are just properties of the brain.
One of the things that was going on during the Great Depression was the beginning of the sort of modern food technology that rules, the way Americans eat today. That is, there are a lot of canned foods were coming onto the market at the time, and also refrigerators were really becoming very, very popular during the Great Depression, both in cities and in rural parts of the country, thanks to electrification, the Rural Electrification Administration. People could buy appliances, farmers could buy appliances, and that meant frozen foods were becoming big. At that time, few people could afford to buy them during the early years of the Great Depression, but, gradually these things picked up. And so this was like the sort of beginning of the era when people were starting to think about supermarkets with rows and rows of freezer cases and rows of canned foods.
Now, the study of biology is responsible for some of the most profounding insights that humans have about the world around them. So take a look at these 4 panoramas. In the upper left, you see some bacteria. This happen to be equal line. You obviously see a butterfly, a flower, a dolphin. If you see that at the outer space just looks these different forms and structures, you have no idea that they were all related to one to another. So one of the most profound things that biology told us is that all life on Earth is exceptionally related similar to one to another. So for example, all of these life forms rely on DNA and RNA for storing and transmitting and using their genetic and inherited information. They are all based on cell. Cell is the fundamental building blocks of all life. All of these organisms consist of cells, and the cells essentially have the same chemicals inside of them: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and the whole bunch of other stuff in much smaller amount. All these organisms conducted metabolism, in other words, chemical reactions that using convert energy from one form to another. And the basic chemistry is all very similar to one and another. The types of molecule is used very similar to one and another.
Well, a historical linguist compares languages at several levels. You start out looking for basic vocabulary. All languages of the world, natural languages at least, have words for eye and head and nose and ear, and for sky and earth, and for water, sand, and for sibling, mother and father. They may not have words for uncle and aunt. It becomes much vaguer because in one culture an aunt is different when it comes from your father's side than from your mother's side. You don't include snow. Most people know what snow is, but in the tropics you don't have it. So you look for notions that are totally comparable and that occur everywhere in the world. You take the 100 or 200 most universal notions in a human life. That is what you call a basic vocabulary. So you take basic vocabularies in languages that you think are related. You look for words that sound the same.
Vitamin D version 2. So today we're going to finish talking about the fat-soluble vitamins. I'm going to start with vitamin D. And I think probably most of you know that vitamin D is called the sunshine vitamin. And it's called that because there's absolutely no dietary need for vitamin D if you get adequate sunshine. And the real important word there is it, because it turns out that in climates which aren't near the equator, there's a big question as to whether or not using these you get adequate sunshine. And that's important because foods are not naturally abundant in vitamin D. And that's why milk is fortified, but the fortification may not be enough. So again, just exposure to sunlight is adequate, no need for vitamin D. So vitamin D really isn't the vitamin, it's a pro-hormone when human beings evolve. We evolved in tropical climates and ran around naked. There was plenty of skin exposure to sunlight, and so there was no dietary need for vitamin D. As humans migrated away from that tropical regions, they actually created a need for vitamin D in food because sunlight was inadequate, particularly during the winter.
I suppose it's the truism to point out that citizens need to be well informed. Maybe it's something we take for granted in our liberal Western democracies, but there will be plenty of societies, well, that is run counter to explicit government policy. Many areas of the world still suffer from the reverie of the deliberate missing information. Governments, especially the unelected ones, but also some elected ones, have denied the events that have ever taken place. They pretend that other events did take place. They would help spin what they cannot deny, ensure they've used every trick of the book to pull the eyes of the world and in an attempt to cover up their mistakes.
For thousands of years, philosophers and astronomers, and thinkers of all sorts, have imagined that the universe, the space around us, was rather like this floor in front of us. It was fixed and unchangeable, and things happen on it, just as people walk around. So the stars, the comets, and the planets, and the other heavenly bodies moved around and traced down their parts on this completely unchanging stage of space. In the 20th century, as the result of Einstein's work, that view of the universe was completely transformed. We began to understand that there was no absolutely fixed stage of space at all on which all celestial notions were played out. But in some sense, on the larger scale in the universe, the space itself was in this state of a continuous dynamic change. That was a prediction made by Einstein. However, Einstein was not the first person to propose the theory, and the theory was proposed by an astronomer called Hubble in the 1920s.
globalization is an overused and often misunderstood concept. We hear it all the time on news broadcasts and in any type of public discussion. But the starting point for understanding globalization is that it is industries and markets that globalize, not countries. That's why it's helpful to think of globalization as the integration of economic activities across borders. But why does globalization matter? I would argue globalization matters because it means the rise of interconnectedness between countries and markets across the world. For example, one of the reasons why the financial crash of 2007 to 2008 was so serious was because the financial and banking systems of countries around the world have become so closely interconnected with the globalization of markets.
About the importance of tea, one of the three most favorite drinks in England, in which the others are chocolate and coffee. Drinking tea in England was a symbol of social freedom, was very expensive and could only be ordered by men in public. Men had tea in coffee houses, making trades and chatting business, while women could only drink tea in private places or wait for their husbands to bring tea back home.
What's the literal definition of risk? Business schools use risk analysis. So what do you mean by risk? And we need a dictionary. When you look at dictionary, this is literal definition of risk. What it says is, the definition, for example, the possibility of injury, a dangerous element or factor, chance of, degree or possibility of such loss, and so on. So risk has two parts, as you look at the literal definition of risk. One part is the consequence of some kind of particular danger, hazard loss, and the other is about the probability of it, chance and consequence, okay? And then at least just as English language concerns, when you look up the word of safe and safety, what you'll earn as, it's a little bit of a loop, a little circular argument that free from harm or risks, secure from danger, harm or loss, the condition of being safe, and so on for all. And why we take out of it. At least when we talk about safe, at least in English language, we are talking absolute something is safe, or it sounds safe.
There are two main categories of memory. Implicit memory, which is also called procedural memory, cannot be consciously recalled. It is an experimental or functional form of memory, informed by cultural and social background. With implicit memory, behaviors are automatic. We recall implicit memories naturally so we are not aware when we are using them. Examples of implicit memory include using languages naturally, driving automatically, reading and writing. When people try to consciously describe how to drive, they may misrepresent how they actually drive. What we often describe as bad memory is explicit memory. Explicit memory is also known as episodic memory, which is totally different from implicit memory. It's more about time and space, and is often related to personal life experiences. Some examples of explicit memory include remembering birthdays from many years ago, or answering multiple choice questions in a test. One of the most amazing things that's happened, even in my lifetime, is the prediction of cosmology. When I started out 40-odd years ago, we thought we knew that the universe began a Big Bang. Some people doubted even then. We thought the universe was about 10 or 20 billion years old. But now, for really very sound scientific reasons, we can say that the universe did start it in a Big Bang, and it's 13.8 billion years old. So it's not 14, it's not 13, because a decimal point in there, and that's a stunning achievement to know that. And we also know that the laws of physics that apply to tiny particles inside atoms also explains what happened in the Big Bang. You can't have one without the other. A very neat example of this is that when you apply nuclear physics, that kind of physics to understand how stars work, you find out that the oldest star in the universe is about 13 billion years old. So their universe is just a little bit older than the stars. Fantastic! If we'd done it and counted in the other way around, and said that the stars were older than the universe, we would say science were in deep trouble. But it's not. Everything fits together, and we know how the universe began. We got to know how the way it is. The future that it'll suspects we don't know quite well what's going, but we got some ideas, which are as good as those ideas we had 40 years ago about how Big Bang happened.